instructional video for AP Macroeconomics. My name is Matt Romano. I'm coming to you from Atlanta, Georgia, and today we are going to be talking about topic 6.5, changes in the foreign exchange market and net exports. More specifically, talking about how changes in currency valuation, changes in exchange rates will affect net exports, and then how those changes in net exports will affect aggregate demand, and of course, all that follows behind with aggregate demand. We're looking at skill 3A, determine the outcome of an economic situation using economic concepts, principles, or models. But really, more specifically, and just as important, if not more, we're looking at making connections between concepts, between topics, understanding causal relationships, because that's such a critical skill in thinking like an economist in macroeconomic analysis, that you've got to be able to see that something happened over here, in this case, maybe in currency markets, and that's going to affect something over here. And we have to be able to connect the dots and accurately understand, the causal relationships that are occurring that result in changes in output, changes in employment, changes in price level, so that we can better understand the world around us, the macroeconomy that we live in. So what it's going to address, this lesson will address how changing currency values are going to lead to changes in trade. So think back to the lessons you've learned about the foreign exchange market. Think about how that's connected to policy. Think about how that's connected to the balance of payments. And then looking at how those changes in net exports are going to lead to a change in aggregate demand, something you've already done. That comes all the way back from Unit 3 and really the first time you learned aggregate demand. As a reminder, again, this is Unit 6. Unit 6 will not appear on the 2020 AP Macro exam. However, it's still important to know this stuff because it's happening all around us all the time. Before getting into the new material, let's warm up a little bit. Let's look at yesterday's FRQ, and then we're going to look at a little bit of old information from Unit 3 that we want to review a little quickly. All right, so yesterday you were assigned question 2 from 2010 Form B. The topic, of course, was connecting policy changes and interest rates to exchange rates and seeing that we can understand all that. So we're dealing with the country of Sewell, another fictional country in the land of AP Macro. The central bank of the country of Sewell sells bonds on the open market. As always, we want to pull something out of that first sentence. They're telling us right now that we've got a contractionary monetary policy here. They're selling bonds, so we know what's going on. We can really predict what's going to happen throughout this question just from that opening sentence. Part A asks us, assume that banks in Sewell have no excess reserves. What is the effect of the central bank's action on the amount of customer loans that a bank in Sewell can make? Well, we know it's, again, a contractionary monetary policy. They're selling bonds, which is going to restrict even more how much banks can lend. As a result, bank loans will decrease. That is your answer there. Using a correctly labeled graph of the money market, show how the effect of the central bank's action on the nominal interest rate in Sewell. Again, a contractionary monetary policy will contract the money supply. It's going to shrink the money supply. So we would anticipate a leftward shift in the money supply curve. So we take that vertical money supply curve, shift left. And of course, that's going to move us up along the money demand curve. And we're going to see an increase in nominal interest rates as indicated from I to I1 on the y-axis. Part C, again, keeping in mind that they sold bonds on the open market. It was a contractionary policy. We've already addressed that there's now going to be a decrease in money supply, increase in interest rate. What's the effect of the central bank's action on each of the following in Sewell? Price level, real interest rate. Of course, we have to explain that. So once again, we're making connections here. What information do I have? What skill do I have from the past that's going to help me connect changes in monetary policy, money supply, changes in interest rate to price level? Well, again, probably the easiest route to go would be to go aggregate demand and think about how with increasing interest rates, you're going to have a decrease in investment. AD is going to shift to the left and price level is going to fall. As far as the real interest rate's concerned, again, we're trying to connect changes in nominal interest rates in the money market to real interest rates. Anytime you see those two together, even if it's not exactly the way you want to go, at least give thought to the Fisher effect and the Fisher equation. It should lead you to the right correct answer. In this case, the real interest rate will rise. Why? We have to explain why. Increase in the nominal interest rate and decrease in price level real interest rate increases. They're basically spelling out the Fisher equation for you in that answer. And that would be a logical explanation because, again, you're giving that causal relationship. Part D, given your answer in part C2, how is the international value of Sewell's currency, the ONO, affected? I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Explain. Well, what did we say happened? Real interest rates are rising. As a result, the ONO will appreciate. Your textbook answer would say because the increase in demand for Sewell's financial assets causes an increase in demand for the ONO. Why is there an increase in demand for financial assets? Well, again, the increase in interest rates, the higher real interest rate, that's an indication that you get higher rates of return on those financial assets in Sewell. People are going to come from outside the country to purchase those, and in order to purchase those, they have to have the currency, the ONO. So you're going to see an increase in demand for the ONO. So that does it for 2010 Form B question 2. Now, rather briefly, let's look at some old information that we learned way back in Unit 3. And we want to connect, again, there it is again, connections. We want to connect changes in net exports to changes in aggregate demand. So again, we did this back in Unit 3. You've known it for a while, but just as a refresher, because we're going to use this today. Net exports is simply exports minus imports, and you can abbreviate a lot of different ways. I had a professor do it this way once, so it kind of stuck with me. I do X minus M, X representing exports and M representing imports. To make sure we know what the words mean, I'm sure at this point we do, but exports are those goods that are produced domestically. So whichever economy you're studying, if you're studying the US economy, they're produced here in the US and they're purchased abroad. They're purchased by residents of another country. Imports were produced somewhere else. They're produced in another country and purchased domestically. Keep that in mind as we're going through this. And now we want to connect, again, changes in those exports and imports and the balance of the two to changes in aggregate demand. And let's look at the two possible examples. On one hand, let's say that exports are rising in this country while imports are falling. If that is the case, net exports are going to go up. And as we know, net exports have a positive relationship with aggregate demand. So if there's an increase in net exports, we're going to see a rightward shift in aggregate demand, an increase in aggregate demand, indicating that there's more money being spent on domestically produced goods. That's what that's telling us. AD shifts to the right. And then, of course, we want to make our conclusions. After AD shifts to the right, output is increased from Y to Y1. Price levels increase from P to P1. And because of that short run increase in output, people are getting hired, employment goes up, unemployment's going down. So all those conclusions are going to follow because of that change in net exports. If the opposite were to occur, if there was a decrease in exports for some reason, and we're going to talk about those reasons in just a moment, a decrease in exports coupled with an increase in imports, then we can expect a decrease in net exports. And as net exports decrease, aggregate demand is decreasing. Again, that tells me that there's less purchase of domestically produced goods in this particular economy. So AD shifts left, and as AD shifts left, we see price level fall, we see output fall. With output falling, some people are let go, so employment falls, unemployment does rise as a result. So again, connect the dots. This leads to this, leads to this, just all this cause and effect that we're constantly seeing in macroeconomic analysis. All right, so that's background, that's foundational stuff. We want to be able to apply that, and we want to be able to apply that within the context of how currency valuation changes in exchange rates are going to affect, really be the first domino in that step to affect net exports, aggregate demand, output, price level, employment, everything else. So let's do this by walking through some examples first. The first is to consider exchange rates fluctuate rather frequently. They're going to fluctuate much more frequently than prices of goods and services do. Commodity prices change a lot, obviously, but when you're talking about products that are being imported and exported, yes, prices do change, but not nearly as often as exchange rates. Go online, go Google forward exchange market and look at how rapidly exchange rates do fluctuate. Now, they don't fluctuate by a large amount. They're very incremental, but they're constantly changing. And over time, it has an incremental effect over really how trade eventually occurs. So exchange rates are going to change more frequently than prices of goods and services, and that's an important point to consider. So let's walk through a hypothetical example of this and see why we can connect those changes in foreign exchange markets to changes in the purchase of goods and services, that being net exports. So the hypothetical is this. Let's assume trade between the United States and Rankin Land. Rankin Land is another fictional land from the 2012 FRQ, if I understand right. Rankin Land is set somewhere way out in the Pacific. Beautiful place, great beaches, palm trees, all that stuff. And we're going to consider trade between the two. And we're going to start, when we consider trade between the two, we're going to start by looking at the currencies. So the currency of the United States obviously is the dollar. The currency of Rankin Land, if you go back to the 2012 exam and look at that question, apparently the currency of Rankin Land is the birra. And a month ago in this hypothetical, we're going to say that there was a 1-to-1 ratio. The exchange rate of dollars to birras was $1 to 1 birra. So if you were in the US and you wanted to purchase birras on the foreign exchange market, it would literally be $1 per birra. That's changed. In our hypothetical example, let's assume that today now $1 actually purchases 2 birra. So there's been a fluctuation on the exchange rate. Foreign exchange markets are moving for some reason. Maybe there was an increase in demand for dollars for some reason, and that led to an appreciated dollar. So we can conclude here that the dollar has appreciated for some reason and the birra has depreciated. If you recall back to previous lessons, these are relative figures, and if one goes up, the other has to go down. So we see that occurring right here. That's old news. We already knew that. That was something you've already learned. But how do we apply that to net exports? And this, for some students, is sometimes counterintuitive. We have to consider, in the case of the United States, how would an appreciating dollar affect net exports? And in the case of Rankin Land, how would a depreciating birra affect their net exports? So again, let's apply it to the purchase of a good. And for a good in this case, what I took was just boxes of chocolates. So we're assuming the relative price here is going to be the same. Say that the price of a box of chocolates in Rankin Land costs 12 birra, and the price of a box of chocolates in America is going to be $12. And we're going to assume those prices are going to be fixed at least for this time period. Because again, if you're talking about going to the store, you go to the grocery store and you buy a box of chocolates, it's not going to fluctuate that much, even if wholesale prices do change. So we're assuming those fixed retail prices here in the short run, but there's been a change in currency values, which could affect how much is being purchased. So walking through the math of this, let's consider how much you would spend if you're in America and you want to import those Rankin Land chocolates that you've heard are so good. A month ago, with that 1-to-1 exchange rate, it's going to cost you $12 to exchange your dollars into birra and buy those Rankin Land chocolates. But now, because you have the appreciated dollar, $1 buys 2 birra, it's only going to cost you $6 to buy that same box of chocolates. All other things held equal, ceteris paribus, that means that Americans are going to buy more chocolates out of Rankin Land. And that's going to increase net exports coming out of Rankin Land. That's the connection we want to make. You don't have to walk through the math of this every time. But what you have to understand is these currency fluctuations are going to impact our purchasing. It's going to impact our purchasing power. So if you're in a country where the currency is depreciating, you can anticipate that exported goods are going to increase, because that depreciated currency, as is the case right here with the birra, that depreciated currency is going to make goods coming out of that country cheaper for people that are buying it in nations that have appreciated currencies, which would be US here. On the flip side of that, take the other perspective. A month ago, 1 birra was worth $1, so it took you 12 birra to buy that American box of chocolates. But now, after the currency valuation has changed, the birra is only worth 50 cents. So now it's going to take you 24 birra to buy that same box of chocolates. The residents of Rankin Land aren't going to buy as many boxes of chocolates from America, and net exports from US are going to decrease. In relative terms, those American goods are now more expensive because it takes more birra just to purchase $1 US. So once again, make the connection here. What you need to know, if the dollar, in this case, we're talking about the US, if the dollar is increasing in value, it's appreciating, US goods are going to become more expensive and net exports from the US are going to go down. Let's look at that same example another way. Instead of using the data here, let's look at it using a graph of the foreign exchange market. And here we have a graph of the dollar on the foreign exchange market as it is in value relative to the birra. And what we see here clearly is there was an increase in demand for dollars, causing an increase in the value of the dollar. The dollar has appreciated relative to the birra. Working our way up the y-axis, we can see that it requires now more birra to purchase $1. The dollar has appreciated, the birra has depreciated. We know from the last slide and from our understanding here that those Rankin-Land residents, the Rankinlanders, they're going to buy less U.S. chocolates. Net exports in the U.S. is going to decrease. And now we need to connect that change in net exports, back to aggregate demand. And again, we know that that's a simple fact. We just talked about it in our review. If United States net exports decrease, then we can easily conclude that United States aggregate demand is going to decrease. And that decrease in aggregate demand is going to decrease output, decrease price level, decrease employment. We're going to see the unemployment rate rise, all because of this changing valuation of the currency. That domino effect is very consistent. We need to be able to make those conclusions as a result. Okay. Let's walk through a few more examples. That's what you need to know. Again, the connection, that's the word of the day. The connection between changes in exchange rates, currency values, changes in net exports, changes in aggregate demand. Work through that sequentially, and you've got this topic down. So guided practice, we're going to go through similar examples and then do a couple multiple choice questions to help us out with, again, another way that these can be asked. Similar to our US and Rankin-Land example, let's look at France and Switzerland. France and Switzerland are trade partners. And I'm going to pause for a moment as I walk through this and let you think through it to try to come up with the answers as we go. A year ago, roughly a year ago, 1 euro was worth 1.14 Swiss franc. Now, roughly now, 1 euro is about 1.05 Swiss franc. Translate that change in exchange rates. In other words, what happened here? There's been a change in the ratio, and I want you writing this down. There's been a change in the ratio. One currency appreciated, one currency depreciated. Based on these ratios, which currency appreciated, which currency depreciated? I'll pause for just a second. Okay, looking at the numbers, again, a year ago, 1 euro could buy you 1.14 Swiss francs. Now, the euro can only buy 1.05. What does that tell you? It should tell you two things. First of all, the Swiss franc has appreciated. We know that because it takes less Swiss francs to purchase 1 euro. The euro has depreciated. It's gone down in value. Got to know those terms. It's depreciated because it won't buy as much as it used to in Swiss francs. That's step one. We've got to understand that connection first. Now, what's the next step? What's the next step in the progression? How is that going to affect net exports? How's that going to affect trade, the balance of trade between these two countries? And then we can make another conclusion after that. Well, the Swiss franc has gone up in value. That means that Swiss goods are going to be more expensive for French residents. If you're living in France and you want to purchase something from Switzerland, you're going to import something from Switzerland, it's going to take more euros to purchase a franc to purchase that good because of that change in valuation. On the flip side, if you're living in Switzerland and you're using Swiss francs, it's going to take less francs to purchase a euro. French goods now become more affordable. As a result, net exports coming out of Switzerland are going to decrease. Net exports coming out of France are going to increase. How does that connect to aggregate demand? AD is going to increase in France and it's going to decrease in Switzerland. Again, it's causal relationships. We're starting with the change in exchange rates and then just connecting the dots. That's going to affect your net exports. That's going to affect your aggregate demand. Let's do one more of these. We're going to do one more using graphs instead of numbers. Make sure this thing's making sense. And then we'll finish off with some multiple choice questions to solidify the whole thing. So one more trade relationship, New Zealand and Hong Kong. New Zealand and Hong Kong are trade partners. The Hong Kong dollar versus the New Zealand dollar is up here on the left. We have the market for the New Zealand dollar. On the right, we have the market for the Hong Kong dollar. Let's just assume for whatever reason, there's been an increase in demand for the Hong Kong dollar. There's been an increase in the supply of New Zealand dollars. We don't know the reason behind this. It could be all kinds of things. It could be a change in interest rates, taste and preference, who knows. As a result of that, we're going to see that the Hong Kong dollar has appreciated while the New Zealand dollar has depreciated. So the question becomes, how's that going to affect trade between those two countries? Again, what you've got to do is look at that change in currency valuation and simply say, how is that going to affect the relative value of goods, the relative price, I should say, of goods between those two nations? If I'm in New Zealand trying to buy goods out of Hong Kong, is it more expensive or less expensive? If I'm in Hong Kong trying to buy New Zealand goods, is it more expensive or less expensive? Well, with a depreciated New Zealand dollar, If you're in Hong Kong, you can buy more with your Hong Kong dollar. New Zealand goods are now relatively less expensive, and we're going to see an increase in net exports coming out of New Zealand, which means a shift of AD to the right. AD is going to increase in New Zealand. Again, just a variety of different ways that we can connect the dots between these different concepts in different contexts. So we're going from currency valuation to net exports to aggregate demand. All right, how does AP treat this kind of stuff? What does it look like on AP exam questions? Going to look at a couple. We're going to look at 3 or 4 multiple choice questions, and then I'm going to leave you with an AP FRQ that you can work on for next time, again, to make sure that this stuff is making sense to you and that you know how to apply this knowledge moving forward. So, first question. An increase in the international value of the United States dollar will most likely benefit, and then there are your 5 answers. Now, again, I've said this before, I know, but one suggestion I always make to my students is when taking a multiple choice exam, and I know it's not on this year's exam, 2020 is obviously an exception, but these are still good for practice, and here's why. When you're taking this multiple choice exam, treat it like a free response question. Before looking at A through E, go ahead and answer the question in your head, know what you're looking for. And again, it's going to train yourself even for those free response questions that you are going to face on this year's exam. An increase in the international value of the United States dollar most likely benefit. All right, stop right there. Don't look at the answers. Who will benefit from this? Well, it's telling me the dollar has appreciated. It's gone up in value. The benefit comes from anyone using United States dollars to purchase goods in other countries, whether they're exporting or they're traveling and buying things. If you're on the other end of that, if you're purchasing US goods with other currencies, you're worse off. You're not going to benefit. Start there. Start with that in mind, then start looking at the answer options. But that's your answer. It's going to be someone who's buying goods with US dollars, exchanging dollars for those now weaker currencies, according to this particular prompt. So looking at A, domestic producers of premium wines sold to people in other countries. All right, so you've got these US producers of premium wines selling them to others. So they're trying to export US goods. That's not going to help an exporter. The exporter now, even though the price of their good domestically has not changed, it's more expensive to someone who's trying to buy it with a foreign currency. Can't be A. Currency traders holding large quantities of yen. No, according to this question, the dollar's getting stronger. If you're trading currency and you have the yen while the dollar's getting stronger, that means it takes more yen to purchase a dollar. You are not better off as a result. German citizens vacationing in the United States, not better off. German citizens are coming here. They have euros. They've got to trade those euros for dollars. If the dollar is getting stronger, if it's appreciating, it means that everything they're buying here is more expensive. D is almost the same one. Canadian citizens expecting to purchase real estate in the US. You're in Canada, you've got to switch your Canadian dollars over to US dollars. Those US dollars just went up in value. You can't buy as much in terms of the real estate. Let's hope it's E, because it's certainly not A through D. E says retired United States citizens living overseas on their Social Security checks. Okay, what do we have? We have US citizens who are paid Social Security, which means they're being paid in US dollars, but they're buying things overseas. Well, those dollars that are coming from the Social Security check, they're worth more overseas than they used to be. They are better off. E's got to be your answer. Okay, so again, go in knowing what you're looking for. And again, treat it like a free response question. You can practice for free response by doing these questions. That's why they're still worthwhile at this point, and you can cover a lot of ground in doing it. Let's look at another. Very similar, but not exactly the same question. The beginning of the question, the beginning of the prompt is identical, but we're going a slightly different place this time. An increase in the international value of the United States dollar will tend to cause, okay, once again, before looking at your answers, let's think, what would an increase in the value cause? Well, all right, so we have an appreciated dollar. What does it mean? It means that if you're in the US, you can buy more goods abroad. But it also means that if you're not in the US goods are now more expensive. So imports are going to go up, exports are going to go down, the balance of trade is going to skew towards a trade deficit. All that's going to be true. We can connect that, we know, to aggregate demand. So if there's a greater amount of imports, less exports, aggregate demand is going to decrease because of the decrease in net exports. And then, of course, from there, we know that output falls, price level falls, employment falls, unemployment goes up. All those things are true. So if I have all that in mind, or I write that down as I'm doing this, I know what I'm looking for. So the first one, A, says United States exports fall. Well, Yeah, that's it. That's exactly it. It's one of the first things that should come to mind when we see an increase in the international value of the US dollar. The dollar is appreciating, US goods are more expensive. That's how you would have to explain it on an FRQ. And exports are going to fall as a result. Look through the rest as just to confirm the answer is correct. National income will increase. No, it will not increase because we already said AD is going to shift left, and that's going to decrease output, which is synonymous with real GDP, real income, national income. Employment in the manufacturing sector increase. No, it's not. We've already said, again, output's decreasing, employment's going to decrease with it. Inflation rate in the US will increase. No, AD is shifting left, price level is actually going to fall. And then the growth rate of the US to increase? No, it will not be increasing as a result of this. The only possible answer is A. Two more, and they're both in the same style. And I chose these specifically because I wanted to share with you a strategy for answering questions like this. And again, once again, I know no multiple choice on the 2020 exam, but the logic is the same, and the logic can still help you when answering FRQs, or more importantly, understanding how these events play out in the real world. Assume that Canadian consumers increase their demand for Mexican financial assets. How would the international supply of Canadian dollars, the value of the Mexican peso relative to the Canadian dollar, and Canadian net exports to Mexico change? Okay, that's a lot. That's three different things that I'm trying to juggle at once. A mistake a lot of students make is they try to process all of that at one time and come up with the correct answer with all three of those changing in their heads, and it's too much to process, it's too much to digest. What I suggest, you're given three different things that you've got to figure out. Go one at a time and work your way through one at a time. Use the process of elimination here. So back up a little bit. Let's think. What's happening here? Canadian consumers are increasing demand for financial assets. So Canadian consumers want to have stocks, bonds, securities of some sort, government, who knows, and they want to purchase them from Mexico. To do so, they need pesos. Well, the first thing on our list is supply of Canadian dollars. The way you buy pesos, if you're in Canada, is you have to bring your Canadian dollars to the market. That increases the supply of Canadian dollars. Start there. Now look at your options. I know that supply of Canadian dollars must increase. I can eliminate C, I could eliminate D, I could eliminate E, and now this is a 50-50. It's either A or B because it must show an increase in the supply of Canadian dollars. Okay, now move on to the peso. In this case, both options are telling you increased value of the peso, and that is correct, obviously. If Canadian consumers are demanding more pesos, increased demand for the peso, that's going to increase the value, obviously. Likewise, the increase in the supply of dollars decreases the value of the Canadian dollar, which of course coincides with an increased value of the peso. So increase is correct there. Next, as a result of this change, what happens to Canadian net exports? Well, the peso just got stronger. We know the Canadian dollar just got weaker by default. If the Canadian dollar is weaker and the peso is stronger, then Canadian goods are cheaper for any people living in Mexico. As a result, then, Canadian net exports must increase. I could eliminate B, and the answer must be A. Again, go sequentially, and it's all about cause and effect. It's all about making connections. Again, that's the word today, making connections from one market to another, from one event to another, and understanding the causal relationships underneath it. Let's do one more of these, and then we're going to move on. If a nation's currency appreciates relative to that of its trading partners, what will happen to the nation's exports, imports, and aggregate demand? Okay, so we've actually answered these separately throughout the day today. Let's go back through it one more time and make sure it makes sense. So the currency is appreciating. The value of the currency internationally has appreciated relative to trade partners. Are those trade partners going to want to buy more goods from the nation or less? Because we're talking about exports first. Well, if the currency is appreciated, their goods are going to be more expensive than they used to be. That tells me that the exports are going to decrease. A and B are not possible answers. Get rid of them. We don't even care what they say about imports and aggregate demand. They cannot be correct because exports is wrong. What about imports? Again, the currency is appreciated, so it can buy more of foreign currencies, which means it can buy more foreign goods, ceteris paribus. That means imports are going to increase. The answer cannot be E. All right, we're down to C and D. What happens to aggregate demand? Well, we have a decrease in exports. We have an increase in imports. That combination makes it pretty clear. AD is going to decrease. It's going to shift to the left. net exports are decreasing, so AD decreases as well. Okay, that brings us to the end. A little shorter today, but it was a relatively short topic where everything kind of goes together. And to review what that was, again, we were using graphs, we were using data to show how changes in the value of a currency lead to changes in net exports and AD. And that was application of, again, economic concept, principles, and models. But more than anything, it was practice using that skill set of connections, of making connections, of identifying and understanding and explaining causal relationships between concepts in macroeconomic analysis. I'll leave you with an exam practice question. 2011, question 2. We're only going to look at part B. This is back to Mexico and Canada and their trade relationship. So we skip part A and just look at part B because we want to see how, again, changing foreign exchange market valuations, how changing exchange rates are going to have an impact on net exports and ultimately aggregate demand. As always, I'll remind you that if you have any tech issues or if anyone you know has any tech issues, please contact the College Board at cb.org/tech, and they want to make sure they can help you before taking that exam in May. And that is everything for today. Thank you for watching. I do appreciate it. I hope you are well wherever you are, and hope you'll join us again tomorrow. Have a great day.